In the vast, unforgiving wilderness of Montana's Flathead National Forest, an aging bobcat named Shadow, once a dominant force, found himself in dire straits. Trapped on a narrow cliff ledge, injured and facing certain death, his once vibrant eyes now held a flicker of despair. When wildlife rehabilitator Jake Thornton, a man whose heart resonated with the cries of the wild, heard a mysterious echo through the canyon, a premonition of trouble gripped him. He discovered the stranded predator, a magnificent creature teetering on the brink. Jake knew the risks were immense. Rescuing a cornered, injured bobcat was a task most would deem reckless, a dance with razor claws and primal fury. Yet compelled by an unwavering sense of duty, Jake faced an impossible choice. He embarked on a perilous descent into the shadowy depths of the canyon, his every muscle screaming in protest against the treacherous terrain. What followed on that precarious ledge defied expectation, a silent communion between man and beast, born of desperation and a shared will to survive. And then, just as safety seemed within reach, disaster struck. On a remote bridge spanning the churning waters of Falling Creek, a violent blowout sent Jake's truck careening into the guardrail, throwing everything into chaos. What happened that day defined trust survival and the extraordinary connection that can form between species when destiny intervenes in the most unexpected and terrifying ways. Before we delve deeper into this incredible tale, take a moment to hit that like button and ensure you're subscribed to our channel for more captivating stories of the wild. Don't forget to ring that notification bell so you won't miss a single heart-stopping moment. The morning light, a pale intruder in the dense pine forest, cast long skeletal shadows across the rugged terrain of Montana's Flathead National Forest. Somewhere within this sprawling wilderness, an aging bobcat named Shadow, a moniker, whispered by the local wildlife researchers who had once tracked his movements, navigated the underbrush with a weary grace. His once lustrous coat had faded with the relentless march of time, peppered with patches of gray that spoke of harsh winters and countless battles. His muscles, though leaner now, still held the phantom memory of the countless hunts and narrow escapes that had defined his 12 hard-fought years in these unforgiving mountains. Shadow had once reigned supreme in these emerald cathedrals, his dominance unchallenged. Larger than most male bobcats, tipping the scales at a formidable 35 pounds in his prime, he had carved out a territory stretching across nearly 15 square miles, a testament to his strength and cunning. Local researchers had, in a bygone era, fitted him with a tracking collar, a futile attempt to chart his movements. But Shadow, a phantom of the forest, had shed it 3 seasons past, vanishing into the wild, as if swallowed by the very shadows he commanded. The wildlife biologists, bound by the cold logic of statistics, had assumed him lost, another casualty of the wild, where few bobcats dared to live beyond the 10th year. But Shadow had stubbornly persisted, a testament to the fierce will to survive that burned within him. He had adapted his aging body, learning to hunt smaller prey, his instincts guiding him away from confrontations with younger, more vigorous males, encroaching on his hard-won territory. This particular morning, however, hunger gnawed at him with relentless teeth, driving him from the relative safety of his den earlier than usual. 3 days had passed since his last meal, and the persistent growl in his belly had become an unbearable torment. His once razor-sharp senses detected the subtle movement of a snowshoe hare approximately 50 yards ahead, a plump prize swollen from the summer's bounty, representing the most substantial meal Shadow had encountered in weeks. The bobcat lowered his weary body to the cold earth, each paw placement a deliberate act of silent precision. His golden eyes, though dimmed by the veil of age, remained fixed on his unsuspecting target, burning with a primal intensity. The hare, sensing an unseen danger, froze momentarily, its twitching nose testing the wind before bolting across a rocky ridge that bordered a terrifyingly steep cliff. A sheer drop of nearly 80 feet to a narrow ledge overlooking the churning icy waters of Fallen Creek. Shadow's predatory instincts, honed by a lifetime of survival, took over. He launched into pursuit, his aging body momentarily recalling the power it once possessed. The chase led them along the precipitous edge of the cliff, a dizzying dance with death. In his younger days, such treacherous terrain would have posed no challenge, his lithe body a symphony of balance and agility. But age had cruelly compromised his footing, his once impeccable judgment clouded by the urgency of hunger. As he lunged for the fleeing hare, his back paw slipped on loose shale, the world tilting violently beneath him. Shadow felt his body plummeting through the open air, his usual grace abandoned as he clawed desperately at the unforgiving cliff face, a silent scream trapped in his throat. A searing pain exploded through his right flank as he struck a jagged outcropping, the impact stealing his breath before he landed hard on a narrow ledge a mere 30 feet below the relative safety of the ridge. The force of the fall left him stunned and disoriented, his senses reeling. When Shadow finally regained his bearings, a chilling realization washed over him. He was trapped. The ledge was barely 3 feet wide at its broadest point, tapering to a precarious 2 feet. Above him loomed the sheer, impassable cliff face. Below, another terrifying 50-foot drop awaited ending in the unforgiving embrace of the creek's rocky shore. He tried to stand a desperate surge of adrenaline coursing through him, but collapsed as a searing pain shot through his right hind leg. Not broken mercifully, but badly sprained, a cruel twist of fate. Blood thick and dark matted the fur on his right side, a grim testament to where the unforgiving rocks had torn his flesh. For what felt like an eternity, Shadow paced the meager length of the ledge, his frantic mind searching for an escape route, a miracle in stone. He attempted to climb the sheer face several times, each effort ending in agonizing failure as his injured leg buckled beneath him, or his dulled claws failed to find purchase on the smooth, indifferent rock. As the day wore on, the cold mountain wind, a biting predator in its own right, cut through his thinning fur, chilling him to the very bone. His cries of frustration, once a powerful roar that echoed through the canyon, grew weaker, a mournful lament carried away by the uncaring wind as his strength ebbed with the fading light. By late afternoon, despair began to creep into his weary heart. Shadow retreated to the innermost part of the ledge, curling into himself in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. His golden eyes, once fierce with untamed determination, now reflected a growing resignation, the light of life dimming within their depths. The great predator, the unchallenged ruler of his domain, had finally encountered an obstacle he couldn't overcome, a silent, agonizing defeat etched in the lines of his aging face. Miles away, Jake Thornton, a man whose soul was intertwined with the fate of the wild, drove his weather-beaten Ford F-150 along the winding Forest Service road, the vehicle's suspension groaning in protest with each rut and pothole. At 45, Jake's weathered face was a roadmap of a life lived under the vast Montana sky, deep lines etched around his perpetually squinted blue eyes, a testament to years spent facing the relentless sun. His brown hair, now liberally streaked with silver, was kept short beneath a faded Montana Wildlife Center cap, a symbol of his unwavering dedication. 2 decades as a wildlife rehabilitator had forged in Jake a profound patience, a deep respect for the intricate tapestry of wild lives, and an almost preternatural understanding of their silent language, their subtle cues. After a formative stint as a ranger with the National Park Service in his younger years, he had found his true calling in the delicate art of wildlife rescue and rehabilitation. Now his life was a careful balance between the structured world of the Montana Wildlife Center, where he tended to injured creatures, and his solitary field work, monitoring the fragile ecosystems of the Flathead region. Spring had arrived late this year, its hesitant touch a stark contrast to the brutal grip of the preceding winter. Many animals were still struggling, their bodies weakened by the relentless cold and scarce resources. Jake had already encountered two alarmingly malnourished elk calves that morning, their fragile forms a stark reminder of nature's unforgiving balance, and had arranged for their urgent transport to the center for intensive care. As he drove along the ridge, the panoramic vista of Fallen Creek Canyon unfolding before him, an inexplicable instinct made him slam on the brakes. Jake couldn't articulate, it couldn't pin it down with logic. Call it intuition, a sixth sense honed by years spent attuned to the subtle rhythms of the forest, but something felt profoundly amiss, a discordant note in the symphony of the wild. He pulled over to the side of the dusty track, the silence of the forest pressing in around him. Grabbing his trusty binoculars from the passenger seat, his heart beginning to pound with a nameless apprehension, Jake stepped out of the truck. A faint sound, almost imperceptible, reached his ears, carried on the whispering wind. It was distinct from the normal chorus of the forest, a subtle cry that pricked at his awareness. Jake stood motionless, his senses on high alert, listening intently. There it was again, a sound that tugged at his soul. Not quite a growl, not quite a cry, but an unmistakable sound of distress that raised the fine hairs on the back of his neck, a silent plea echoing through the vast emptiness. Jake returned to his truck, his movements now driven by a focused urgency. He retrieved his well-worn backpack, a lifeline filled with essential rescue gear, a comprehensive first aid kit tailored for the unique needs of wildlife, and a collection of emergency supplies. He clipped a handheld radio to his belt, a fragile thread connecting him to the human world, and began following the faint sound on foot. His experienced eyes scanning the terrain, his every step measured and cautious. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as he approached the edge of the canyon, the ground crumbling beneath his boots. "Hello." He called out, his voice a solitary human sound, swallowed by the immensity of the wilderness, hoping against hope that perhaps a lost hiker was in trouble. Only the sighing wind answered his plea. Jake crept closer to the precipice, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs, and peered over the edge. His binoculars pressed against his eyes, meticulously scanning the rugged cliff face. At first, he saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the familiar tapestry of rock formations and the tenacious vegetation clinging stubbornly to the canyon walls. Then a fleeting flash of movement caught his eye, a flicker of tawny fur against the gray stone. Focusing his binoculars with painstaking care, Jake's breath hitched in his throat, a cold knot of dread tightening in his stomach. Approximately 30 feet below, on a narrow, precarious ledge, a bobcat was pacing anxiously, its movements jerky and uneven. Even from this distance, Jake could discern the unmistakable signs of injury. Dark blood stained its right flank, a stark crimson against its tawny coat, and it moved with a pronounced limp, each step a visible struggle. The bobcat was larger than most he had encountered in his years of rescue work, a magnificent specimen, though it appeared somewhat emaciated, its ribs perhaps showing beneath its fur. As he watched a wave of helplessness washing over him, the animal attempted to climb the sheer cliff face again, its claws scrabbling desperately for purchase, only to slide back down to the narrow ledge with a frustrated cry that pierced the silence of the canyon. Jake estimated the bobcat had been trapped for at least several agonizing hours, possibly since the early morning. The declining afternoon temperature, already hinting at the frigid night to come, would soon become lethally dangerous for an injured animal, especially one weakened by what appeared to be prolonged starvation. For most people, even seasoned wildlife professionals, the smart decision would be to call the Forest Service or the Wildlife Center and let them handle the situation. Attempting to rescue a cornered predator, especially a bobcat, was considered an act of extreme folly, a reckless gamble with sharp claws and teeth capable of inflicting grievous injury. But Jake wasn't most people. He had successfully navigated the treacherous terrain of predator rescue before including the delicate extraction of a young, terrified mountain lion 3 years prior. Moreover, something about this particular bobcat's desperate predicament resonated deep within him. The animal wasn't just trapped. It was exhausted, visibly injured, and clearly teetering on the brink of collapse, its spirit flickering like a dying ember. Without swift intervention, Jake knew with a chilling certainty it would not survive the unforgiving night. Jake understood the inherent risks, the potential for serious injury, the razor's edge he was about to walk. He also knew, with an unwavering conviction that settled deep in his bones, that he couldn't simply turn his back and walk away. He returned to his truck, his mind racing, and gathered additional equipment, his movements now swift and purposeful. Climbing gear, a specialized reinforced transport carrier designed for the containment of potentially volatile predators, heavy-duty Kevlar gloves that had saved his hands more times than he cared to remember, and a tranquilizer gun, a last resort in the delicate dance of rescue. He hesitated over the tranquilizer, the weight of the decision heavy in his hand. Sedating an already weakened animal could be catastrophically risky, especially without knowing the full extent of its injuries or how long it had endured without sustenance. Jake made a difficult decision. He would bring the tranquilizer as a contingency, a final option, if all else failed. But he would first attempt the rescue without the potentially life-threatening effects of chemical restraint. After radioing his precise location and his perilous intentions to the increasingly concerned staff at the Wildlife Center, Jake meticulously prepared for the descent. He secured a robust climbing rope to a sturdy ancient pine tree, its roots clinging tenaciously to the rocky soil well back from the treacherous edge. He tested the anchor point with his full weight, the rope groaning under the strain, but holding firm a fragile thread of hope in the face of danger. Satisfied with its stability, he began his slow, controlled descent, his movements fluid, and practiced years of navigating unforgiving terrain evident in his every step. As he neared the narrow ledge, the bobcat, its senses still sharp despite its weakened state, became acutely aware of his presence. The animal retreated to the farthest edge of the precarious outcropping, its golden eyes, now wide with a primal fear, fixed on Jake with a palpable mixture of terror and defiance. A low guttural growl, a warning etched in the ancient language of predator and prey, emanated from its throat, a sound Jake understood perfectly. "Easy there, old-timer," Jake said softly, his voice a calming balm in the tense silence, keeping his tone even and non-threatening. "I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to..." He had always spoken to the animals he rescued, a habit born not of a belief in their understanding of human words, but in their uncanny ability to sense the gentle cadence and non-threatening intent in his voice. He continued his descent, moving with agonizing slowness to avoid startling the already traumatized predator, his own heart pounding in his chest like a frantic drum. When his worn boots finally touched the narrow ledge, Jake remained perfectly still, a silent offering of peace, giving the terrified bobcat precious moments to acclimate to his sudden, unwelcome presence. The ledge was even narrower than it had appeared from above, a sliver of rock, barely 3 feet at its widest point, tapering to a treacherous 2 feet where the injured bobcat now crouched, its body pressed against the cold, unforgiving stone. One wrong move from either of them, Jake knew with a chilling certainty, could send them both plummeting into the churning abyss of the creek below. "You're in quite a spot, aren't you?" Jake murmured, his voice low and soothing, carefully removing his backpack and retrieving a pair of thick, reinforced leather gloves, his hands trembling slightly despite his years of experience. "Let's see if we can get you out of here." The bobcat growled again, a low rumbling sound that vibrated through the tense air. But Jake noted with a flicker of hope that it lacked the raw intensity typical of a healthy, threatened animal. Its sides heaved with each shallow breath, and fresh blood continued to seep from the raw wound on its flank. a grim testament to its suffering. Up close, Jake could see the undeniable signs of age. This was an older male, well past his prime. The scars of past battles etched into his weathered face, yet still possessing a regal bearing, a shadow of the powerful predator he once was. The animal's right hind leg appeared severely injured, though thankfully not broken from what Jake could cautiously observe. Normally, in a situation like this, Jake would utilize a capture pole, a long rod, with a looped cable at the end, allowing him to secure a potentially dangerous predator from a safe distance. But the impossibly confined space of the ledge rendered such tools useless. He would need to physically handle the bobcat to get it safely into the transport carrier, an extremely dangerous proposition under any circumstances, a dance with the wild that could end in serious injury for both of them. Jake spent what felt like an eternity, nearly 20 agonizing minutes, simply sitting still on the cold, hard ledge, a silent observer in the drama unfolding. He occasionally spoke in soft, reassuring tones, his voice a gentle murmur against the backdrop of the rushing creek, but made no sudden movements toward the terrified animal. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, the bobcat's guttural growls subsided, replaced by a tense, watchful silence. But its golden eyes, those ancient orbs that held the wisdom and the wildness of the mountains, never left Jake's face, scrutinizing his every twitch, every subtle shift in posture. The wildlife rehabilitator, with his years of experience reading the silent language of animals, recognized the look in those weary eyes. It wasn't just fear. It was a profound exhaustion, a surrender born of pain and depletion. The fight, the fierce will to resist, was slowly draining out of the proud predator, minute by agonizing minute. As the sun began its slow descent toward the jagged horizon, painting the canyon walls in hues of fiery orange and deep purple, Jake knew with a growing urgency that time was running out. The temperature would plummet rapidly after sunset, and neither he nor the injured bobcat could safely endure the frigid night on this exposed, precarious perch. He slowly, deliberately removed the heavy-duty transport carrier from his pack and placed it carefully between himself and the wary animal, gently opening the door, an invitation into the unknown. "I know you're not going to like this, old-timer," Jake murmured, inching forward with agonizing slowness, his every movement a calculated risk. "But it's your only way out of here." The bobcat tensed its muscles, coiling like springs beneath its fur as Jake moved closer, the scent of human, a stark intrusion into its wild world. But it didn't retreat further. There was nowhere left to go, the cold stone wall of the cliff face, a stark barrier behind it. Jake had mentally prepared himself for a fight, for the desperate lashing of claws, the snapping teeth, the raw unleashing of primal fury that he had witnessed countless times in his career. He had steeled his nerves for the adrenaline surge of imminent danger, the primal dance between rescuer and the wild. What he wasn't prepared for, what struck him with the force of a physical blow, was what happened next. As he reached within 3 feet of the injured animal, close enough to reach out and touch its matted fur, the bobcat's entire posture subtly shifted. The rigid tension in its body seemed to ease almost imperceptibly, a fragile truce in the silent war it had been waging against its predicament. And though a profound weariness still clouded those ancient golden eyes, the murderous intent Jake had braced himself for simply wasn't there. Instead, something else flickered within their depths, something that resonated deep within Jake's soul and shocked him to his core. A flicker of recognition. Not a recognition of Jake personally, but a deeper, more profound recognition of intent. Somehow, in the silent language that transcended species, this wild, fiercely independent predator seemed to understand on a fundamental level that Jake represented its only slender thread of hope, its sole chance at survival in this desolate, unforgiving place. Moving with a deliberate slowness that belied the frantic pounding of his heart, Jake reached out a gloved hand toward the injured animal, his voice a continuous low murmur of reassurance. The bobcat's ears flattened against its head, a sign of apprehension. But it didn't strike, didn't unleash the expected torrent of aggression. Taking a deep, steadying breath, Jake gently grasped the bobcat's forelegs, his grip firm but careful. He braced himself for the inevitable resistance, the frantic scratching, the desperate biting, the unleashing of primal fury. Instead, the bobcat remained surprisingly still, its body trembling slightly beneath Jake's calloused hands, a fragile vessel of pain and exhaustion. With painstaking care, Jake began to lift the animal, cradling its injured hindquarters to avoid putting any further pressure on the sprained leg. The bobcat weighed far less than Jake had anticipated, another stark indicator of its prolonged suffering and inadequate nutrition. As he raised it off the cold stone of the ledge, he felt the rapid, frantic beat of its heart against his forearm, the faint warmth of its ragged breath on his wrist. One sudden twist of that powerful neck, one desperate swipe of those razor-sharp claws, and Jake's arms could be shredded his lifeblood, staining the unforgiving rock. But the anticipated attack never came. With agonizing slowness, Jake maneuvered the surprisingly compliant bobcat into the relative safety of the transport carrier and secured the latch. Only then did he allow himself to exhale the breath he had been unconsciously holding, a silent release of the immense tension that had gripped him. The animal made no sound from within the carrier, a silence more unnerving in its stillness than any snarl or growl. Now came the next daunting challenge, getting both himself and the precious cargo of the carrier back up the treacherous cliff face. Jake secured the carrier to his climbing harness, double-checking the straps to ensure it would remain stable during the arduous ascent. The added weight made the climb even more physically demanding, his muscles screaming in protest with each upward pull. But Jake's arms, strengthened by years of relentless outdoor work, did not falter. By the time they finally reached the relative safety of the ridgetop, twilight had descended upon the forest, casting long, eerie shadows that danced with the whispering pines. Jake was drenched in a cold sweat despite the cool evening air, his muscles burning with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. He carefully placed the carrier on the level ground before collapsing beside it, his chest heaving as he gulped in the crisp mountain air, the scent of pine and damp earth a welcome relief. Through the ventilation holes in the carrier, Jake could see the bobcat lying still, its golden eyes half closed with a profound exhaustion that mirrored his own. Both man and animal had reached the very limits of their endurance, bound together by the shared ordeal. "We made it, old-timer," Jake said between ragged breaths, his voice thick with emotion. "We actually made it." As his breathing gradually steadied, Jake considered his next crucial steps. The Montana Wildlife Center was over an hour's drive away, a significant distance for an injured and weakened animal. The bobcat desperately needed professional veterinary care for its injuries, but moving it immediately after the trauma of the rescue and the climb might inflict further potentially fatal stress. Jake made the decision to rest briefly, allowing both of them a precious respite, before beginning the long journey back to his waiting truck. As he sat beside the silent carrier, the weight of the evening pressing in around them, Jake found himself pondering the extraordinary behavior of this particular bobcat. Its almost complete submission to human handling, without the need for sedation, defied everything he thought he knew about wild predators. Perhaps its injuries and utter exhaustion had simply sapped its will to fight, leaving it with nothing but a primal instinct to seek any form of relief. Or perhaps... Jake's thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound emanating from within the carrier. Not a growl, not a hiss, but a soft, almost gentle chuffing noise. He leaned closer, peering through the narrow ventilation holes. The bobcat had shifted its position and was now looking directly at him in the fading light. In those ancient golden eyes, Jake thought he saw something that resonated with a profound depth, a silent question hanging in the air between them. "Don't worry," Jake said softly, his voice filled with a quiet reassurance. "I'm going to get you some help." He rose stiffly to his feet, his muscles protesting with every movement, and carefully lifted the carrier, its weight now feeling even heavier with the added burden of responsibility. The walk back to his truck was slow and deliberate, each step measured to avoid jostling his fragile and unusual passenger. Jake's mind raced with possibilities for the Bobcat's care, the daunting challenges ahead. Its advanced age and weakened condition would undoubtedly complicate treatment. But Jake had witnessed seemingly miraculous recoveries before. If rehabilitation was successful, the question of release back into the wild loomed large. Given the animal's apparent age and the severity of its ordeal, survival on its own would be a long shot, a cruel toss of the dice against the unforgiving hand of nature. When they finally reached the battered Ford F-150, its familiar silhouette a welcome sight in the encroaching darkness, Jake carefully secured the carrier on the passenger seat rather than in the truck bed, wanting to keep a close eye on his silent companion during the long drive ahead. He radioed ahead to the Wildlife Center, his voice still hoarse with exertion, informing them of his imminent arrival with an injured adult male bobcat, emphasizing the unusual circumstances of the rescue. As Jake drove through the darkening forest, the headlights cutting twin swaths through the inky blackness, he occasionally glanced at the carrier beside him. The bobcat remained quiet, its breathing rapid, but steady, a fragile rhythm of life in the stillness. Something about this particular animal had touched Jake deeply, stirring emotions he couldn't quite articulate. Perhaps it was the quiet dignity with which it had faced its desperate predicament, or the implicit trust, if that wasn't too human a concept to apply to a wild creature, it had seemingly shown during the perilous rescue. Whatever the reason, Jake felt a profound connection to this magnificent animal, a bond that transcended his usual professional compassion, a silent understanding forged in the crucible of shared danger. The winding road followed the course of Fallen Creek for several miles, the rushing water a constant murmur in the night. Jake slowed as he approached a small single-lane bridge that crossed to the eastern bank, its wooden planks worn smooth by time and countless journeys. He noted how the creek had swollen with the recent spring runoff, the normally placid water now churning white as it surged over the rocky creek bed with surprising force. Halfway across the narrow bridge, a sudden violent bang ripped through the quiet night, the sound echoing off the canyon walls like a gunshot. Jake's right front tire had blown out with terrifying force. The truck swerved sharply, the steering wheel bucking wildly in his hands as Jake fought desperately to maintain control. On the narrow span of the churning water, a deadly invitation below. The vehicle slid sideways with alarming speed, the tires screeching in protest against the rough wooden planks before crashing violently against the weathered guardrail with enough force to deploy the airbags in a jarring, explosive cloud of dust and smoke. Dazed, but miraculously conscious, Jake felt a warm trickle of blood seeping from a cut on his forehead where it had struck the steering wheel. The deflated airbag hung limply before him, and through the haze of pain and disorientation, Jake's first frantic thought was for his fragile passenger. The transport carrier, unsecured by a seatbelt, had been thrown violently to the floor during the impact, its doors springing open with a sickening crack. The Bobcat was gone, nowhere to be seen in the wreckage of the cab. No, Jake groaned, a raw sound of despair tearing from his throat, his fingers fumbling frantically with his jammed seatbelt. No, no, no. He pushed open the mangled driver's door and staggered out onto the bridge, his legs unsteady beneath him. The cool night air, sharp with the scent of pine, and the metallic tang of blood, cleared his head somewhat, though a wave of dizziness threatened to topple him with each unsteady step. Jake scanned the length of the bridge frantically, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, calling out into the darkness as though the wild animal might somehow respond to his desperate human voice. A fleeting movement at the far end of the bridge near the shadowy tree line on the eastern bank caught his attention. The bobcat, its limp now more pronounced, was making its way slowly but determinedly toward the dense underbrush. Despite its obvious injuries, the primal instinct for freedom seemed to override the pain, propelling it forward. "Wait!" Jake called out reflexively, his voice hoarse and filled with a desperate plea, then laughed a bitter, self-deprecating sound at his own foolishness. What did he expect that a wild bobcat, having just escaped a terrifying ordeal, would heed his human command? He watched helplessly as the animal, a fleeting shadow in the darkness, disappeared into the dense undergrowth, swallowed by the indifferent embrace of the forest. All that agonizing effort, all that terrifying risk, for nothing. The bobcat, Jake knew with a sinking feeling of despair, would likely succumb to its injuries without immediate treatment or fall prey to larger predators in its weakened state. A crushing sense of failure washed over him, heavy and suffocating. Leaning heavily against the damaged guardrail, the cold metal biting into his skin, Jake tried to focus his scattered thoughts. He needed to report the accident, his own throbbing head wound demanding attention. The worried staff at the Wildlife Center would be waiting anxiously for his arrival. With a heavy sigh that seemed to carry the weight of his dashed hopes, Jake reached for his handheld radio, his only link to the outside world, only to find it shattered and useless in the violent crash. "Perfect," he muttered under his breath, a bitter irony coloring the word. Turning back toward the mangled remains of his truck to retrieve his cell phone, a sliver of remaining hope, that's when he saw it. The bobcat had emerged from the shadowy underbrush and was standing at the very edge of the bridge. Its golden eyes twin embers in the darkness, reflecting the shattered headlights of Jake's wrecked truck. For a long, silent moment that stretched into an eternity, predator and rescuer regarded each other across the fractured space, a silent communion in the aftermath of chaos. Then, inexplicably, the bobcat began to move its limping gait, slow and deliberate, back toward Jake. Jake remained perfectly still, his breath caught in his throat, afraid that any sudden movement might spook the wary animal, sending it fleeing back into the impenetrable darkness. The bobcat approached slowly, its limp now even more pronounced, a testament to the pain it must be enduring, until it stood just 5 feet away. In the stark illumination of the headlights, Jake could see with a sickening clarity that the animal was in even worse condition than he had initially feared. Its breathing was shallow and labored, and fresh blood had seeped through the matted fur on its flank, a grim reminder of its ordeal. "You should have kept going, old-timer," Jake said softly, his voice thick with a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Your freedom was right there." The bobcat took another hesitant step forward, then another, until it stood directly before Jake, its gaze unwavering. What happened next would remain etched in Jake's memory, a moment of profound and inexplicable connection that defied the cold logic of the wild for the rest of his days. The bobcat lowered its head and gently, almost imperceptibly, pressed its forehead against Jake's leg, a fleeting touch that spoke volumes in the silent language of the wild. The gesture lasted only a fraction of a second before the animal stepped back, its golden eyes still locked on Jake's. But its meaning was unmistakable, a silent offering in the face of shared adversity. "I'll be damned." Jake whispered, tears welling in his eyes, a raw emotion that transcended mere sympathy. Whether it was gratitude, a primal instinct of trust in the only source of help it had known, or simply the desperate seeking of comfort in the face of overwhelming pain, and the bobcat had made a choice that defied the very essence of its wild nature. It had returned to the human who had twice now held its life in his hands. Moving with deliberate slowness, His own body aching and stiff, Jake knelt down and extended his hand, palm down, a non-threatening gesture he had used countless times with frightened animals. The bobcat tensed its muscles, coiling slightly, but it did not retreat. When Jake's fingers made gentle contact with the top of its head, it flinched almost imperceptibly, but allowed the touch a silent acceptance. "Let's try this again." Jake said, his voice thick with emotion, a lump forming in his throat. "Let's get you some help." Using his own jacket as an improvised makeshift carrier, Jake carefully lifted the surprisingly docile bobcat, which offered no resistance, its fragile body surprisingly light in his arms. He placed the animal gently on the passenger seat of his wrecked truck and climbed in beside it, the scent of blood and fur filling the damaged cab. The vehicle miraculously was still operational despite the flat tires and the significant body damage. Jake drove slowly, hyper-aware of his unusual and precious passenger sitting freely beside him, a wild predator placing its trust in a human hand. When Jake finally arrived at the Montana Wildlife Center shortly after 9:00 p.m., his disheveled appearance caused an immediate stir. Dried blood stained his face from the head wound, and he emerged from the battered truck cradling a fully conscious bobcat in his arms, like an oversized, albeit wild house cat. "Jake, what the hell?" Dr. Sarah Blackwood, the center's head veterinarian and Jake's colleague of 15 years, rushed forward, her face a mask of concern before stopping short at the unbelievable sight of the unrestrained predator. Are you carrying a bobcat without restraints?" "It's a long story, Sarah." Jake replied, the exhaustion evident in every line of his weary face, his voice raspy. "But this old guy needs help, and so do I, as it happens." The next few hours passed in a blur of focused activity. The bobcat was immediately sedated and examined thoroughly. Dr. Blackwood confirmed Jake's initial grim assessment: severe dehydration, critical malnourishment, a deep laceration on the right flank that would require numerous stitches, and a badly sprained right hind leg. X-rays revealed the telltale signs of advanced age: arthritis in several joints and evidence of old, long-healed injuries that spoke of a life lived on the razor's edge. Blood tests further confirmed the bobcat was approximately 12 years old, an astonishing age for a wild bobcat, a testament to its resilience. While a nurse gently cleaned and bandaged Jake's head wound, Dr. Blackwood shared her findings, her expression grave. "He's in rough shape, Jake. Even without the new injuries, his body is just wearing out. Advanced arthritis, significant dental issues, diminished kidney function, all consistent with extreme old age for his species. The fact that he survived this long in the wild is nothing short of miraculous." "Can you help him?" Jake asked, his voice tight with concern, his gaze fixed on the sedated animal on the examination table. Sarah hesitated, her professional demeanor momentarily softening. "We can treat the immediate injuries, get him rehydrated and fed. We can certainly make him more comfortable. But Jake..." She continued, her voice gentle but firm. "You know as well as I do that releasing a bobcat this old back into the wild would be a death sentence. He's simply not capable of hunting effectively anymore. He'd starve or become easy prey." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling heavily in his heart. "And keeping him here long-term isn't really an option, is it? We're not set up for permanent care of predators, especially not one with his complex medical needs." Sarah's silence confirmed what remained unspoken: the likely and often kindest outcome for elderly wild animals unable to survive on their own. Humane euthanasia once the bobcat was stabilized and comfortable. "Let me think about it," Jake said quietly, his gaze lingering on the old bobcat's still form. "He's earned that much." 3 weeks later, the Montana spring was in full bloom, a vibrant tapestry of emerald and gold. Jake stood on the back porch of his rustic cabin, the rising sun painting the distant snow-capped mountains in hues of soft gold and rose. The fragrant steam from the coffee mug in his hands mingled with his breath in the cool morning air, a peaceful tableau. The gentle sound of the screen door opening behind him drew Jake's attention. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her own coffee mug clutched in her hands, a soft smile gracing her lips. He ate all of it this morning. She reported, her voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. And he's putting weight back on. The wound is healing cleanly. A genuine smile touched Jake's lips, a rare and welcome sight. He's a fighter, that old boy. After that pivotal night at the Wildlife Center, Jake had made an unprecedented request, a plea that had stretched the boundaries of protocol and regulation. He had asked to take the elderly Bobcat home during its recovery period. Sarah had initially refused, citing a litany of valid concerns: safety regulations, the sheer audacity of the request. But Jake's quiet, persistent argument that the only other viable option was euthanasia had eventually swayed her cautious heart. With special permits painstakingly arranged through their extensive connections at the Forest Service, and a strict detailed protocol for the animal's care, meticulously documented, the extraordinary arrangement was finally approved. Jake had swiftly converted his spacious tool shed into a comfortable, secure recovery space for the Bobcat, whom they had begun to affectionately call Shadow, a nod to the dark markings that framed his wise, ancient face. Sarah visited regularly, her medical expertise ensuring Shadow received the best possible care, administering medication and monitoring his slow but steady progress. To everyone's surprise, the old Bobcat was responding remarkably well to the consistent care and quiet environment. "I submitted the final paperwork yesterday," Sarah said, leaning against the weathered porch railing, her gaze drifting towards the sun-drenched forest. "If approved, you'll be the first licensed rehabilitator in the state permitted to provide permanent sanctuary care for a non-releasable native wildcat on private property." Jake nodded, his expression thoughtful, his eyes following the flight of a robin in the nearby trees. "The committee seemed genuinely impressed by your detailed proposal for the enclosure design." "I've already ordered the materials?" Jake replied, a hint of anticipation in his voice. "Once the permit comes through, I can start construction immediately." Sarah turned to face him, her expression serious. "You understand what you're taking on, right, Jake? He might live another year, maybe even 2, with proper care. That's daily feeding medication, constant monitoring. You'll essentially be tethered to this place until he's gone." Jake met her gaze, his own unwavering. "I know." A comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the chirping of birds and the rustling leaves. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice soft. "What made you decide to do this, Jake? In all the years I've known you, I've never seen you get this attached to a rescue." Jake was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the distant, majestic peaks of the mountains. The memory of that terrifying night on the bridge, the unexpected return, the gentle press of a wild head against his leg, flooded back with vivid clarity. "When we were on that bridge," he finally said, his voice low and filled with a quiet emotion, "after the crash, he could have disappeared forever. Freedom was right there for the taking. Instead, he came back to me. That means something, Sarah. I can't explain it, not in any logical way, but it means something." Sarah didn't argue. She had witnessed the unusual bond that had formed between Jake and Shadow firsthand during their treatment sessions. The Bobcat, a creature that by all rights should have been aggressive and fearfully defensive, instead displayed a remarkable tolerance for Jake's presence even seeming to seek his proximity when anxious or in pain. "Well," Sarah said finally, a warm smile returning to her face. "The old fellow certainly landed on his feet, didn't he? From starving on a cliff ledge to having his own private wilderness estate with room service." Jake chuckled, a genuine, heartfelt sound. "Don't let him hear you say that. He still has his dignity, you know." Later that morning, after Sarah had departed, Jake visited Shadow in the converted shed. The old bobcat was resting comfortably on a specially designed platform that allowed him to survey his surroundings from an elevated position, his wise golden eyes tracking Jake's every movement as he entered the quiet space. "Morning, old-timer," Jake said softly, his voice a gentle murmur in the stillness. "Hear that I've got permission to build you a proper home here." As if understanding the comforting tone, Shadow blinked slowly, a deliberate movement. Then with a slow, deliberate grace that hinted at the power he once possessed, he rose to his feet. His movements were still stiff and careful, but the desperate weakness of those first harrowing days had given way to a measured strength. He approached the front of the enclosure, and in a gesture that still resonated deeply within Jake, gently pressed his forehead against the sturdy mesh separating them. Jake extended his fingers through the wire, gently touching the familiar spot between Shadow's ears that the bobcat had indicated he enjoyed. A deep rumbling sound emanated from the animal's chest, not quite a purr in the feline sense, but as close as a wild bobcat could manage a profound expression of contentment. "You and me." Jake whispered, a deep sense of peace settling over him. "We've got a deal. For as long as you need." Outside, the spring sunlight filtered through the burgeoning leaves of the pine forest, casting dappled shadows across the rugged terrain of Montana. Somewhere in this vast wilderness, a younger, stronger bobcat would perhaps claim the territory once ruled by Shadow. The relentless cycle of life and survival continuing its eternal dance. But here, in this unexpected sanctuary, an aging predator and the compassionate man who had twice saved his life had forged something rare and precious, a connection that transcended the natural boundaries between wild and tame predator and human. Shadow, who had once ruled these forests with unchallenged dominance, would now know something perhaps even more valuable than fleeting freedom, the quiet peace of security and the unwavering companionship of a human who had recognized in those ancient golden eyes a dignity worthy of respect and a life worth saving. Jake watched as Shadow returned to his comfortable platform and settled down, his golden eyes half closed in peaceful contentment. The wildlife rehabilitator smiled, a profound understanding dawning within him. Some rescues changed the animal, offering a second chance at life. Some rescues changed the rescuer, opening their hearts to the unexpected bonds of the wild. The best ones, Jake reflected, changed them both, leaving an indelible mark on their souls, a valuable lesson. The extraordinary bond between Jake and Shadow reminds us that compassion and trust can bridge even the most seemingly insurmountable divides, including the boundaries between species. It highlights the inherent worth of every living creature, regardless of age or perceived wildness, and the profound impact that a single act of kindness can have on a life teetering on the brink. It teaches us to look beyond our preconceived notions and to recognize the unexpected connections that can enrich our lives and the lives of those around us, both human and animal. What are your thoughts on this incredible story? Have you ever experienced an unexpected connection with an animal? Share your comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more tales of the wild, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for future updates. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss out on our latest content. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Let us know in the comments.